Thomas Aquinas, applying logic in matters of faith. The Greek emphasis on reason and debate had inspired some 12th century theologians to explore how much of theology could be understood through logic. This pursuit only intensified from 1150 onward, when many Greek texts, especially the works of Aristotle, were translated from Arab into Latin. Among them was Aristotle's Metaphysics, which gave a proof, as he called it, and a description of God solely based on logic. Hey, good to see you. This is Stephan, author of In Search of the Sublime. On this World History channel, we'll trace humanity's relentless pursuit of scientific truth, moral excellence, and enlightenment. We'll meet anyone from Mesopotamian astronomers and Indian yogis to Greek philosophers and Enlightenment scientists. And you'll meet them firsthand using primary sources, giving you valuable insights that transcend the surface-level understanding you get on other channels. Go check it out for yourself. Let's start. A century later, Aristotle's texts were supplemented by the works of Aristotle's most famous Arabic commentator, named Ibn Rushd, who came from Córdoba, Spain, and who became known in the West as Averroes. Together, Aristotle and Averroes were referred to as the philosopher and the commentator, suggestive of their influence. Averroes had attempted to reconcile Aristotle's rational worldview with Islam, and the scholastic philosophers of the Middle Ages hoped to do the same, but now for Christianity. To many medieval scholars, the works of Aristotle were only exceeded in importance by the Bible itself. Yet being of pagan origin, the works of Aristotle were rarely read for their own sake. Instead, they were generally used mainly to gain a more sophisticated understanding of God. Yet, as you can imagine, the interjection of logic in matters of faith was often seen as scandalous and heretical, and the study of Aristotle was even forbidden in the universities on many occasions. For instance, in 1210, at the Synod of Sens, 10 members of a small Aristotelian sect were even burned at the stake for believing in pantheism, the idea that God is everywhere. At the same council, it was also decided that, quote, neither the books of Aristotle on natural philosophy nor their commentaries are to be read at Paris in public or in secret, and this we forbid under the penalty of excommunication. Yet this ban was generally neglected in the universities. The curiosity of the Western mind had just become unstoppable. As a result, the ban had to be renewed in 1228, when the Pope claimed that the masters of theology at Paris were, quote, committing adultery with philosophical doctrines. And in 1277, the Pope banned 219 philosophical and theological theses by Aristotle, Ibn Rushd, and even some by Thomas Aquinas, whom we will mention later in this lecture. Among the objections of the Pope was the belief that God was ignorant of human lives, that God was just one among many gods, and that the world was eternal instead of created. Another common complaint was Aristotle's over-reliance on logic in matters of faith. The fear was that all these claims could bring scripture into question, and thereby threaten the church. The return of debate as a means to get to the truth, which was also endorsed by Aristotle, also intensified in the 12th century AD. Disputation or debate even became a standard element of academic training at the University of Paris, under the name Questiones Disputata. An early proponent of this method was Master Simon of Tournai. His lectures were so popular that even the largest lecture halls of Paris could barely contain his audience. His method was to regularly introduce questions to his class. After each question, he would then construct a thesis based on authoritative sources, so the Bible and the text of the later church fathers. And he then would allow a student, known as the opponents, to raise objections against his thesis. And then finally he would bring everything together and offer a solution to the question. Later masters at Paris also added a respondent, a student who answered the objections as well. And in the 13th century, some disputations even became open to the general public, and sometimes members of the audience were even allowed to pick the subject. This type of disputation was especially harshly criticized, since the unpredictability of the questions from the audience could easily steer the debaters into dangerous heretical territory. And we read the debates, although technically meant to constructively find truth, often transgressed into cockfights, with the contestants, quote, pecking and clawing at each other, in the words of a chancellor of the University of Paris. And here we see an image from the Middle Ages of one of these debates. We see two masters here debating each other, while the students at the back are clearly participating in the debate. And we read in the surrounding text that they were actually debating Aristotle's definition of happiness. Disputation eventually also found its way out of the universities. For instance, it became an important tool for members of the Dominican Order. This order was founded in Toulouse by a man named Domingo de Guzman, who had the goal of converting heretics, especially the Cathars, who were an influential heretical group at the time. To be effective at convincing these heretics, the Dominicans taught themselves the skill of disputation. Domingo himself supposedly converted hundreds of Cathars to public disputations, which were presided over by judges. As the Dominican Order grew and became more international, they eventually received an official order from the Pope to, quote, seek out diligently those who are heretics or infamed of heresy. And the order was then allowed to burn unrepentant heretics at the stake. And in this way, the Dominican Order, supposedly a Christian institution, became entangled with the Inquisition. Disputations in textual form also originated in Paris. In these texts, an author would pose a series of questions, and after each question, he would provide first arguments against his own position, and then he would refute these arguments. This turned out to be a great way to logically dissect an issue and to get to the bottom of it. Peter Lombard, a former student of Abélard, who we discussed in the last lecture, applied this method in his famous Sententia, which became a popular textbook intended to give students a summary of all theological knowledge available at the time. But the technique was most famously applied in the Summa Theologia, or Everything About Theology, by St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. Thomas was himself an Italian Dominican scholar who came to study under the great philosopher Albertus Magnus at the University of Paris. In Paris, Thomas Aquinas oversaw various disputations, both private and public, and like Abélard, he reasoned that the use of reasoned arguments was the only way to truly understand a topic, in contrast to arguments from authority that would just leave students with an empty mind, as Thomas called it. In his Summa Theologia, Thomas also attempted to cover all there was to know about theology, and at the same time he tried to harmonize Christianity with Aristotle's rational theory of the universe. This massive work, 4 times the length of the Bible in total, covers about 2,500 theses combined with 10,000 objections and their rebuttals. To get a feel for his method, let's examine the first entry in his work. The first question asks, quote, whether besides the philosophical sciences, any further doctrine is required to understand the world. Or phrased in a different way, can we understand the world through reason alone? Against his own position, Thomas then argued that, quote, man should not seek to know what is above reason, but instead men should just stick to the facts. On top of this, he added that it is also possible to argue logically about God, as Aristotle has done in his Metaphysics. So here he argues that reason is all that is necessary. But then Thomas presented his counter-arguments, which were actually his own arguments. He noted that, quote, "Scripture, inspired by God, is not part of the philosophical sciences, but it does contain knowledge necessary for man's salvation. So," he concluded, "the knowledge from the Bible is also necessary." He then explicitly leaves open whether the knowledge that is contained in the Bible could perhaps also be attained through reason. But he says that even if this is the case, these reasons could be understood only by the greatest geniuses and therefore would be of no use to the masses. So even if this was the case, the Bible is still necessary, apart from reason. And in this logical manner, he attempts to go through all the important theological issues of his day. Although the Summa Theologia was huge, it was in fact never finished. In 1273, Thomas Aquinas is said to have had a mystical experience that made him abandon the project. When his scribe begged him to continue, he replied, "Reginald, I cannot continue, because all that I have written now seems like straw to me." A very famous anecdote from the Middle Ages. Unfortunately, he died only 3 months later, at the age of 50. Now, let's end with a short peek at what is to come. The Summa Theologia is rightly regarded as the most ambitious and influential theological text. Yet writers from the later Renaissance generally saw the work as overly dry and logical. The work is hard to read because of its abstract language and the frequent use of jargon. It speaks of accidentals and substance and essence and quiddity and the four causes, mostly Aristotelian concepts. And the work also tends to reduce theology to a mere logical discipline, while if you actually read the New Testament, it is much more about living a good life. Renaissance thinkers were instead generally more interested in the humane side of religion. They were even harsher in their critique of John Scotus, who, in an attempt to improve on the work of Thomas Aquinas, made even subtler distinctions in jargon. In fact, he was even known as the subtle doctor, which at the time was seen as a compliment. But when much of medieval theology was seen as useless, it became somewhat more of a slur. Yet, it is fair to say that the culture of scientific inquiry that would develop eventually during the Enlightenment could not have come about without the groundwork laid by these medieval scholars. For as I've proven to you in the last 3 lectures, they restored the torch of reason in the West, and we should be forever grateful. And that was it for today. If you want to know more about these topics, read my book In Search of the Sublime. You can read it for free on worldhistorybook.com. See you there. Bye-bye.